Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to be discussing H.Y. Siddiqui's models of community organization. So far, in the previous videos, we have discussed Murray Ross's typology of community organization. We've also discussed Jack Rothman's models. So we had looked at Murray Ross's the general content approach, the specific content approach, and the process approach. And in the second video, I had spoken to you about Jack Rothman's three different models: the locality development model, the social planning, social policy mode of intervention, and the third one is social action. Now in this video I'm going to be talking about H.Y. Siddiqui's three different models, that are neighborhood development model, system change model, and structural change model. Now this is not directly given in your syllabus, but it's very important for you to understand this typology as well, because these are indigenous models and have been indigenous. By indigenous I mean that Siddiqui, while practicing in the Indian context, has developed these models. So if you really want to do community work, want to apply all these things in your field, it's important for you to understand these models as well, as they'll help you. They'll be very handy for you when you actually go and work in the field, because they have been developed according to the Indian context. The earlier two models that we had discussed, they had the context was American, but this one, the context is Indian, so you'll be able to relate to it much more, although those two models are also used in the Indian context. So now let's get started with it. Siddiqui has the categorization that he has given, it's quite similar to that of Rothman, and it comprises of three models. As I told you, it was given in the year 1997. The first model within that is neighborhood development model. It's quite similar to Jack Rothman's locality development model. Well, here let's see what all this model says. So in this model, the general neighborhood, the term neighborhood has been used for community itself, and the general assumption underlying this model is that people living in the community, or the neighborhood as we may call it, have the basic and inherent capacity of meeting their own needs. So this model presupposes that people of a community have certain inherent capacities to look at their problems, to find out indigenous solutions with the help of indigenous resources available to them. So what is the role of a social worker or a community organizer in all this? So many of you have told me that when you go to the field, you find people not very cognizant of their needs. You find the community members initially when you go there. You may be able to see a lot of problems in the community, but when you speak to the community, they do not really, these problems, the problems that you see do not come up as problems. Why? Because you think the community is very apathetic. You feel that, you know, they're not able to probably articulate their needs, or they don't want to talk about it. So as a social worker, your responsibility is to induce the talk on those needs. Your responsibility is to induce that process which will make the community realize this, and consequently make efforts to achieve a great degree of satisfaction for its own members, individually and collectively. Now you say that when I say that you need to induce that process, it means that the community has capacity, but that capacity might be latent, it's not manifest. So the role of the community organizer is to stimulate that capacity, mobilize people, talk to them through their take them through their problems, and make them realize their latent capacities. And once they become self-sustaining, then you step back, you take a step back. Now in this particular model, there are two important things to understand. Is one is that here we are not just talking about creation of certain services in the community. Of course that is important. One is that according to this model, if there is a lack of certain services in the community, then with the help of the members of the community, members of the community themselves work towards creation of that particular service. But another important thing also here in this model is that it also aims at starting a sort of a people's participation. So there are different groups in the community. When I say groups, there can be women, there can be women groups, there can be different caste groups, different class groups. So these all groups have to be included in this process, and this is how, when all the groups come together to work at their own common problem, it sort of also strengthens the process of democracy. So here we looked at that the aims are twofold. One is creation of any service in the community, and second is people's participation, creation of service through people's participation, which leads to strengthening of a democratic system in the community or in the neighborhood. You also, as a community organizer, lay emphasis on encouraging thinking on part of the people themselves, so that they may adopt progressive attitude rather than doing things for them. They need to have progressive attitude. So as a worker, your role is to unleash their developmental energies within the community, rather than you just becoming a provider of services to them. As we have discussed in the locality development model also, when people work for their own needs, the change or the process becomes sustainable in itself. Now, there are certain specific steps involved in this model. They are: the first one is identification, local and demarcation of physical area. Now, what are you calling a neighborhood? What exactly is a neighborhood for your program or for your work? You demarcate that. That's the first step. Then is entry into the community. Obviously, you enter the community then. The third one is, once you've entered the community, what do? You identify the needs of different sections of the society, different sections of the community. Once you have identified the needs, you know which need to work on, you start planning the program. Once the program planning is done, the fifth one is resource planning. You start to find out the resources available for that particular plan. Now, the sixth one is developing an organizational network in the community. I've spoken about it at length in various classes, that once you know the resources that are available, what you have to do is you have to do networking, organizational networking. You know that, these are the organizations working in this area, or these are the people working in this area on probably if there is suppose I had given you an example of substance users. I told you that when I went to the community, it was very hard for me to reach the people, the substance users there, and I identified some of the organizations that were already working in that area on that particular issue. It became very easy, and they already had they had reached out to the people had faith in them, so it became easier for me to mobilize more and more people through those organizations. So networking becomes really important when you're working in the community, and it helps you get things done faster, at a faster rate also. Now, once you have developed an organizational network in the community, and the plan is set and the execution happens, and finally there is withdrawal within a time frame. So you set a time frame when the community organizer or the social worker withdraws from the community. Now, in the Indian context, it has been seen that the social workers or the agency for which you are working as a social worker, the withdrawn is gradual, and it's not a complete withdrawn ever. It's a partial withdrawal. So these are the steps that you identify the area, demarcate the area, enter that area, find out the needs. Once the needs are decided, you decide on the program plan. Program plan is done. In order to execute the program plan, you need resources. You find out resources, then you develop an organizational network within the community, and finally you execute the plan, and then you step back. Now, this model has been, although it is one of the most commonly used models in the Indian context, but there are certain limitations to this, and a lot of people have critiqued it also. So people say that again, this model, like the locality development model, looks at the micro context only. It does not look at the macro context. So there can be a lot of influences which impinge on the micro context, but they are not taken into account while implementing this model. So they often get bypassed. So that's one major constraint of this model. Another one is, when you say that you need to ensure that all sections of the society participate in this, right? Because you need to strengthen democracy also with it. But the problem is that, we live in a society where a lot of them are wage earners, and for them to expect that, you also have to do this work. They already have a pressure of ensuring that they give bread and butter to their family. You are expecting something else also from them. So I think this kind of a also is a constraint of this particular model. Then, when we talk about the use of indigenous resources within this model, we say that indigenous resources are used, they are relied upon. Again, when we say indigenous resources, there is a limit to the use of indigenous resources, and many times you need resources from outside, you need funding from outside. But in that case, a lot of times it has been seen that if the funding is given from outside, too much funding is given from outside, people tend to become dependent, over dependent on the community organizer. Again, Dr. Neeragni Mitra gives an example that during her work in the Garhwal region, she saw that there was a lot of, people were very traditionally very keen on protecting their environment. And planting trees was a part of their cosmology. They were very interested in planting trees, looking after their environment. And once the government started a particular scheme wherein people were paid for planting trees. So now this sort of an I would say incentive made the people dependent on that sort of a funding, which they were doing. So when we are saying that use the indigenous resources, of course, there's a limitation to that because the indigenous resources can be limited. But when we say outside funding, that again can make people dependent on the source of funding. So we need to sort of maintain a balance between the two. The last constraint that we talk about is that I've already spoken about it, that the social worker within this model is not able to completely withdraw. There is, in the Indian context, a partial withdrawal of the community organizer or the community worker. Now, this was the neighborhood development model. We will move on to the second model, which is the system change model. Now, for the system change model, for that to understand, I'll read it out later, but I want you to first give an example, understand it through the basis of an example. Now, suppose for your one of your fields, Majra Shuraj, many of you have been saying that you have witnessed a lot of dropout rate in children, school going children. So now you may see it as a problem with the children, or a problem with the parents' perception that children don't need to study after a certain extent, and it has been specifically in the context of a girl child that you have seen a lot of dropout rate. Now, I want you to understand that if you go and work they're thinking that they're dropping out because it's the problem with the children or problem with the parents, what you do is you go to the child, try to convince the child. You go to the parents, try to convince the parents to send the child to school. You go to the school authorities, try convincing them that this children should sit in the school, they not drop out, so the school ensures. Then what you do is you sort of do a moral policing, ensure that they don't drop out. But once you withdraw yourself from that community, you realize that again that problem has started, right? It's not a long-lasting change that you see. So here, maybe you did not realize that the problem of dropout is not because of the perception of people. It can be because of some other reason. Now, the problem can be because the school is not attractive enough for the child to go there. The way the teachers have been teaching is not attractive enough for the students to stay and learn there. Or maybe, like I've seen many of you putting up statuses. If children are happy that the schools are closed during the corona pandemic, then the schools better look at their curriculum and the way they are being teaching students. So exactly, that's the point that I'm trying to make here, that children being happy that the schools are shut, or children dropping out of the school, can be a sort of a system failure. We as a community, in the community or the society, there are various systems that operate, and this education system is one of them. So maybe it's a failure of the education system that the students do not want to go to the school, right? So when you work, you need to work in order to solve these problems, work with the various subsystems within this educational system. What can be the subsystems? The subsystems can be NCRT, CBSE, teacher training program. How are the teachers trained to teach students? So these are all the subsystems. Now, you have to understand what are the failures within the subsystems that are pushing pressure on the whole system, the whole education system, which is making the education system sort of dysfunctional in nature. Now, this is what the system change model is. So there are systems, you have to change them. System change model. Right now, I think I've explained it. There's nothing. Okay, I'll take you through the specific tasks associated with the system as well. The first one is collecting relevant facts about the specific deficiency in the system. So you, as I gave you example of the education system, first try and collect facts related to it. The second one is, so it can be, the facts can be related to access of the service. Maybe the schools are not close by, lack of trained functionaries, the teachers are not trained enough to teach the students, make the classes interesting. There can be lack of funding for the schools, which is leading to some sort of inadequacy. There can be, I've given this example earlier also, like in one of the cases it was seen that the girl child are dropping out because there was no toilet in the schools available for them. So whatever deficiencies are there, you sort of collect the facts related to them. The second step in this is sharing the findings with the community. Now you go and share these findings with the community. The third is selecting an appropriate strategy to influence decision-making bodies. Now you know that in order to change these deficiencies of the education system, you need to pressurize the decision-making authorities, the higher-ups, or you need to if not use the word pressure, I would say you need to convince them to change the system to some extent. Then so you sort of select an appropriate strategy to influence the decision-making bodies or to focus their attention on the issue. Then you mobilize the community and outside support to put the plan into action without the community saying that this is the need. You alone will not be able to do anything. So the community has to come together with you on this issue, and you sort of plan the action. The fifth is developing an organization in the community and linking it to similar organizations in other communities and other agencies which can help them in demanding change. Now, when you're demanding change at this level, it's always better that you look at other organizations working in that area, in other similar communities like that, and bringing them all together to demand change. Because if one community demands this change, it may come through, may not come through. But if a lot of communities come together and demand similar change in the system, then it should definitely come through. So this was the last step. I hope it's clear to you what is system change model. The third one is the structural change model. Now, let me tell you the critique of the system change model. Now, the critique can be that it can be a very time-consuming process to do so, because you're looking at system change, and it's not simple. It's not easy to bring about a change in the system itself. So that is one critique, and also you need to keep the spirits of the people high in order to convince them, mobilize them, and to work towards the change. Right. The third one is the structural change model. Now, what is the structural change model? This model visualizes the community as a small cell within the larger body of society. In other words, various tiny communities constitute the bigger whole, that is the society or the nation state. And this model also assumes that the manner in which the relationship between different sections of the population is structured. When I say how the relationships of different sections are structured, I'm talking about the formal relationships like the constitutional framework, law, policies, how the laws and policies of a particular nation or a society binds the people together. That's the formal structure. And the informal structure is the customs, the public opinions, how all these informal structures bring the people together, and they determine the social rights of the individual. So this model also determines the relationship of state vis-a-vis the individual or the community, and also the intra-community and inter-community relationships. Now, in structural change model, what the worker's role is, the worker analyzes the link between macro structuring of social relationships and micro reality. Now, in the previous, the neighborhood development model, I had said one of the critiques of neighborhood development model is that it only looks at the micro reality. Micro reality means only the reality of that particular community. But this particular model is saying which is called the structural change model. This particular model is saying that a community which you are working with, it's like a small cell. It's a part of the larger whole, of the larger society. That larger whole can be a nation, can be the international, like if I say, suppose Jat village, or any other village, Majra village. These villages, these communities where you're working, they are like a smaller cell. They're part of the larger Haryana state, or Haryana is part of the larger Indian community. On Indian community also, when I say Indian laws, they are made. They have, when the laws are made, they sort of show that there is an external force on these as well. To make it easier for you to understand, I hope you remember when I was teaching globalization, I had told you about World Bank and the various strategies used by World Bank and IMF, and how when the whole like post 1990s, when the liberalization happened, what a lot of yeah, so I was saying a lot of during that time, a lot of pressure was put on by the World Bank or the IMF on the third world countries, which sort of had impacted the distribution of goods and services in the society. I hope you remember I had given you the example of how consumerism had increased post 1990s when the liberalization happened and a lot of foreign companies came in, and how you were forced to buy certain products because of the kind of advertisements that constantly on a loop kept playing on the TV sets. So at such times, therefore, there is a need to influence the larger world order in order to be able to bring changes in the micro context, in the context of your community, your nation. You need to change the larger world order. Now, this sort of a model is very complex in nature, because the social workers feel that they do not have that sort of a preparedness in order to challenge the larger world order. But I would also reiterate here that as social workers, you also that's the reason you're trained in different subjects. You're trained in polity, you're trained in economy, you are given knowledge about human relationships, how the human psyche works, and the importance of relationships. You're also told about the societal structures, the political structures, so that you understand the whole macro context as well. Now, another critique of this particular model is that it's very time consuming. You need to have a lot of skills in order to, when you're thinking of changing the whole world order, you need a lot of skill sets for that. You need to keep the spirits of the community high to convince them that this has to be done. So it sort of requires a lot of energy, efforts, and it's a long drawn out process. Now, what are the specific steps or the tasks involved in this model? They are to develop an understanding of the link between micro and macro social realities. Now, for a social worker, it's the responsibility of the social worker to sort of make the community understand the link between the micro context and the macro context, right? The second is to make a conscious decision about an alternative political ideology. Now, if you are asking for some change, that means you're asking for some alternate way of thinking, alternate way of being. For that to happen, you need to make a conscious decision about that alternate political ideology. The third is to share this understanding with the community. Like when I'm saying no alternate political ideology, maybe it sort of brings me to the question that's happening these days. There is a sort of you might have seen, like I was seeing that there's a lot of xenophobia happening. Xenophobia is when you start looking down upon, start hating the person of some other, some foreigner. Like in China, a lot of xenophobia is happening. Like the Chinese people now have started looking down upon the foreigners that stay in China, because they're thinking that the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, will come back because of these people. And in the Indian context also, you might have seen, I wouldn't be naming, but it has been happening that one community has been put against the other community, and in the larger world order also the same similar thing has been happening, that a particular community is being targeted for something. So And as social workers, when we talk about the principles of social work, and we say that need to have a non-judgmental attitude, and we cannot be judging somebody on the basis of their color, or on the basis of their race or religion or caste, for that matter. And you realize that even the larger world order is doing the same thing. So in order to convince your community, you have to tell them the linkages between the micro and the macro. Now coming to, then you share that understanding with the community to enable them to make their own decisions. Now it's for the community to make its own decision, to realize what it has to do. The fourth is to help the community identify a plan of action to pursue its goal by locating specific issues and consequent action to launch a long struggle. As I said, it's a long drawn out struggle. So the community has to identify the plan of action and to pursue its goals by locating those specific issues and the consequent action. And the last one is to help the community sustain its interest and enthusiasm, as I said earlier, and the capacity to meet the strain which is likely to arise out of this inevitable conflict with the existing power structure. Now, when you're talking about an alternative ideology, political ideology, you have to understand that when you talk about alternates, that means you want to shake up the existing structure. And when you say, that means you come in conflict with the existing power structure, which is not easy to come by. I've explained this in Rothman's model also. It's very difficult. You need a lot of enthusiasm, efforts. You have to stay positive in order to do this. So this sort of community work is therefore very radical in its orientation. Obviously, you're trying to radically change something, and the achievement of any goal may be the objective. However, is equally important that people gain in terms of greater self-confidence, organization and social skill, and derive an understanding of the vital issues which concern them in the society. So you're sort of preparing them to understand the vital issues, link between the micro and the macro context. And these were the three models of Siddiqui, the three models that Siddiqui has given. I hope I've made them clear to you, and I hope you're able to use some of them in your field as well. Thank you.